you will, go ahead and take your Bibles this morning and be turning to Matthew chapter 19, and we're going to be focusing our attention in that text for the next few moments together. I do appreciate so much the invitation to come and to be with you this weekend on your lectureship effort that you are having. Appreciate Wayne so much, the good work that he's been doing here over the last couple of years. So thankful for the friendship that we've been able to build with one another. The great work that he's been doing here. We are definitely going to miss him at South Haven as well. I know that GBN is going to miss him also, but he has been such a great asset to the North Mississippi area over the last couple of years. But we do want to bid him the best of work going forward. We appreciate him and Cindy so much for the good work that they've been doing. Appreciate Nesbitt. You have been such a stalwart of soundness for a number of years, and we are so thankful for the relationship that we get to continue to have with you at South Haven. This weekend, you are studying about a very important set of topics, questions that perplex. And this morning in particular, we're going to be focusing on a question that is very, very perplexing. As we think about this question, as we think about the topic that we're going to be considering for the next few moments, I personally believe that it is one of the most controversial and one of the most emotionally charged subjects out of any subject that we could study together. This particular topic that we're going to be studying together this morning is one that has probably affected more congregations of the Lord's church than perhaps any other subject. It's the subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. When we think about this particular subject, I was reading a statistic recently that said that there will probably be at least 100 million divorces that will take place around the world in the year 2019. Now think about that statement for just a moment. 100 million divorces will be granted around the world. Do you know what that means? That means at least 200 million people are going to be affected by divorce, and that's not even counting the children in these relationships as well. I wish that I could say that this is just simply a problem that's going on out in the world. But brethren and friends, this is a subject that's been affecting the Lord's church for a number of years as well. I don't know of any other subject that's caused more splits, but not only with that, there are a number of preachers that have decided to stay silent on the subject. And not only are they staying silent on the subject, you have leaderships that when people want to place membership with the local congregation, they will not ask any questions pertaining to those individuals' marriages whatsoever. And that's a sad thing, the state of the church in some areas today. I think it's the case that sometimes individuals may have the idea that topics that we are dealing with today in the 21st century, that was foreign to the first century mind. But that can't be said about the subject that we're talking about this morning, marriage, divorce, and remarriage. This was one that was very, very relevant in the first century. When we open our Bibles to Matthew chapter 19, we're going to begin at verse number 1. And let's notice what the text tells us. The Bible says, "And it came to pass that when Jesus had finished these things, he departed from Galilee, and he came into the coast of Judea." Now I want you to look at the very next two words, beyond Jordan. Notice that phrase, beyond Jordan. Some scholars have said that this area that's described as beyond Jordan was the land of Perea. Now, the land of Perea was under the jurisdiction of Herod. And you may recall back in Matthew chapter 14 that John the Baptist had come in, and what was he preaching about? He had a discussion with Herod about his marriage, didn't he? It's unlawful for you to have her as your wife. And it was so emotionally charged that it ended up costing him his life, didn't it? Now drop down to verse number 3 of Matthew chapter 19. The Pharisees came unto him, tempting him. When you see this word tempting here, it's not the way that we generally think about it today, where we think about an individual being tempted to sin. No, this word here means to test maliciously. Those Pharisees came to Jesus to test him maliciously. They were not interested in finding truth. They were more interested in finding fault. They were more interested in trying to trap Jesus in his words so that they could limit his popularity. Well, as he's made his way here to the land of Perea, this area beyond Jordan, guess what subject they want to talk about when he comes? It's the same subject that John the Baptist addressed. Here's the question that they have. Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? We want to know, can you put away your spouse for any reason? For the next few moments today, we're going to ask ourselves 3 questions. The overall topic is, what does the Bible say about marriage, divorce, and remarriage? But we're going to simply simplify that even more. Here are 3 questions that we're going to discuss today. Number 1, what does the Bible say about marriage? Number 2, what does the Bible say about divorce? And then our third question, what does it say about remarriage? Here's the first one. What does the Bible say about marriage? And as we seek to answer this question, there are 4 P's that we're going to look at. Number 1, it is a place of honor. Hold your finger there at Matthew 19, because we're going to be coming back and forth to this chapter a number of times. But let's go to Hebrews chapter 13 and verse number 4. And here we're going to note that it's a place of honor. The Hebrews writer tells us that marriage is honorable in all. Did you see what he said about marriage there? It's something that is honorable. Did you see the root word of that word honorable? It's the word honor. Now, if you turn over to 1 Peter chapter 3 and you look at verse number 7, you may recall that in this context, in verses 1 through 7, Peter is going to talk to his readers about the subject of marriage. And he's talking to husbands and wives. You remember what he says to husbands? He says, husbands, honor your wives. It's that same root word, same Greek word, a little bit different ending on the word, but that word means to treasure. It means to value. So he says, husbands, I want you to treasure, I want you to value your wives. But when you bring it back to Hebrews 13 and verse number 4, what's he saying about marriage? I want you to treasure it. I want you to value it. I want you to hold it in the highest of esteem, because that's the way that God sees marriage. It's the oldest divine institution known to man. But that brings us to a second P. Number 1, it's a place of honor. But number 2, we see the participants. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 19. When you look at Matthew chapter 19, let's begin at verse number 4. He answered, that is, Jesus answered and said unto them, have you not read that the he there is God, that God which made them at the beginning? When you see that phrase, at the beginning, that is a universal statement. And so he says, at the beginning, not only is it universal, it's a timeless statement. At the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. In our teenage class at South Haven on Sunday mornings, we are studying about the ABCs of Christianity. And what we're doing each week is we're talking about a different topic in the Scriptures that corresponds with a different letter of the alphabet. Last week, we got to the letter M. Guess what subject we talked about? We studied about marriage. And I asked them this question from Matthew chapter 19. I said, how many participants are there in marriage? And it possibly came across as a trick question because most of them answered very quickly and they said 2. But you know, when you look at Matthew 19, 4 and 5, there's actually 3 that are a part of marriage. Who are they? You've got God, you've got man, and you have woman. Now, some have tried to tell us that are advocates of homosexuality that it's okay because Jesus never specifically condemned it in his earthly ministry. You ever heard somebody say that before? Well, you know, Jesus never did condemn homosexuality, so that must mean that it's okay. But you know what he did do? He told us who the participants of marriage are. And when he tells us who those participants are, that excludes everyone else. He said God, man, and woman. That rules out God, man, and man. That rules out God, woman, and woman. That rules out God, man, and beast. God, woman, and beast. Number 3, we think about the purpose of marriage. Have you ever sat back and really thought about the purpose of marriage? When you look at Genesis chapter 2 and verse number 18, one of the purposes of marriage is to address our social needs. You remember it was there early on in the garden that God saw that it was not good that man should be alone, and he said, so I'm going to make a helpmeet for him. He's addressing social needs. You remember that Solomon said that 2 are better than 1? Number 2, a second purpose of marriage is to address physical needs, to address physical desires. Did you know that God placed within every single one of us physical desires? And there is nothing wrong with having those physical desires because God has given those to us. However, he has placed regulations, he's placed restrictions around when those physical desires can be exercised. Go back to Hebrews 13:4, and we're going to notice the second part of it. Marriage is honorable in all. What's the next part say? And the bed undefiled. And so the restriction for those physical desires is only to be met within the confines of marriage. And then number 3, you have a third purpose of marriage, and that is to have children. Genesis 1:28, be fruitful and multiply. But that brings us to a 4th P, and that is the permanency of marriage. How long is marriage supposed to last? What was God's intention on this subject? Let's go back to Matthew chapter 19. Let's notice what Jesus has to say. He says, verse number 6, wherefore they are no longer 2, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. You ever really thought about what that phrase, put asunder, means? How many of you ever use that language in your everyday conversation with someone? I don't know that I have ever, in a normal conversation, said put asunder. You know what some of the new translations translated as? To separate. Jesus says, what God has joined together, let not man separate. Now let's turn over to Romans chapter 7 and let's look at verse number 2. Romans 7, verse number 2. You may remember there in Matthew 19:5, he says that a husband and wife, when they leave father and mother, what do? They cleave to their spouse. What does that mean? To glue together, an adhesive. And he says you don't separate that. Now look at Romans 7, verse number 2. He's going to make an illustration here concerning the old law. He makes a parallel with marriage. He says, for the woman which hath a husband is bound by the law to her husband, so long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. When we think about those vows that we make at a wedding ceremony, that those couples make, that phrase, till death do us part, where do we get that from? Romans chapter 7, verse number 2. That brings us to our second question this morning. What does the Bible say about divorce? What does it say about divorce? Now, before we notice exactly what the Scriptures teach us about divorce, there are going to be some other preliminary questions that we're going to address for just a few moments. Number one, what does the word divorce mean? Webster's dictionary defines divorce this way as the legal disassociation or dissolving of a marriage. A number of years ago, Brother Foy Wallace described divorce this way. He says it means to render null and void the marriage relationship. Another question, why do some people get divorced? What are some of the most popular reasons that people get divorced for today? Financial problems, religious differences. Some get divorced because of abuse. Perhaps one of the most popular ones that's out there today is irreconcilable differences. Then you have those that have been unfaithful to one another. And so they get divorced for those reasons. When we think about the word divorce in the King James, did you know that that word is only found one time? It's found in Jeremiah chapter 3 and verse number 8. Now the word divorced in the past tense with the ed is found 4 times. And the phrase writing of divorcement is found 6 different times. But even though the King James doesn't necessarily use that language that we would use today, there are some other words or phrases that the King James writers would use to describe divorce. I want to share just a few of those with you for just a moment. Let's turn to Malachi chapter 2 in verse number 16. We're going to notice the phrase here for just a moment, and we're going to come back to this text in just a couple of minutes. But you'll notice here that the prophet, he's going to use the phrase putting away. In Matthew 5:31 and 32, Matthew 19:9, Jesus will use the phrase put away. And then in Luke 16:18, you'll see the phrase putteth away. All of those are references to the subject of divorce. Now let's think about this question. How does God view divorce? How does God view it? In Malachi 2 and verse number 16, we see the answer. The prophet says this. He says, "For the Lord, the God of Israel, saith that he hateth the putting away." He hates it. Now, have you ever thought about why it is that God hates it so much? Why does he detest it? Why does he find divorce so repulsive? I believe it's because divorce robs those couples of the happiness that God intended for them to have. But not only that, when you think about the children that may be involved in those relationships that have separated like that as well, there's going to be a lot of problems that are going to come forth from that. Did you know that psychologists have said that divorce is worse than the death of a spouse? Think about that statement. Psychologists have said that a divorce is worse than a death of a spouse. Now, someone might be thinking, why in the world would a psychologist say that? How does that make any sense? Because generally when a divorce takes place, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of resentment and bitterness. But 9 times out of 10, when you lose a spouse through death, you've got a number of good memories that you can look back upon, and you cherish those memories. One person said that the only people that really benefit in a divorce are the attorneys. And I think that's exactly right. But as we think about the subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage, that brings us to our final question. What does the Bible say about remarriage? What does it say about remarriage? And I think with the things that we've studied about so far, that there's really no question with those. What does it say about marriage? What does it say about divorce? But where there seems to be so much controversy in our world today, and even in the church, is around this last question: what does the Bible say about remarriage? And maybe it could be the reason that there's so much controversy because we want to focus on so many of the things that the Bible doesn't say. But let's begin with a series of questions. What does Jesus say about this subject? What does he say about remarriage? And then we're going to take several other questions from there. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 19. Let's begin at verse number 3 once again. Pharisees, they come to him, they're tempting him. Is it lawful? Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? Did you know that during the first century that there were two schools of thought concerning the subject of remarriage? You had two very famous, influential rabbis. One, his name was Rabbi Hillel, and Rabbi Hillel held to the philosophy that you can divorce your spouse for any reason under the sun. If your spouse burns the food, if your spouse cooks something you don't like, you can divorce them. If your spouse gets their hair cut in a way that you don't like, if your spouse comes home 5 minutes late from work, you can say, I want a divorce. But then there was another rabbi. His name was Rabbi Shammai, and he said there's only one reason, and that is fornication. Now let's notice what Jesus says on the subject. Drop down to verse number 9. Jesus says, I say unto you. That was an authoritative statement that he's making. In fact, when the Sermon on the Mount concludes, you remember what they were saying about him? He's one that spoke with authority. They were saying he doesn't speak like the other religious leaders where he gets his authority from somebody else. They were saying it's as if authority resides in him, which it did. And so Jesus makes this statement, I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whosoever marrieth her which is put away, doth commit adultery. I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty plain, pretty simple, doesn't it? Jesus gives one reason. He gives one exception to the rule, to that permanency, till death do us part, and he says, for fornication. But then he also addresses the other side, and shall marry another, committeth adultery, and whosoever marrieth her which is put away, doth commit adultery. And so Jesus says there's one reason, and there's one reason alone, and that is fornication. Now let's take a moment and let's define this word fornication. I realize that we do have just a few younger ones in here this morning, so we're going to use some mature language to define this out. We're going to use it one time. We're not going to go over it again, but just one time to describe fornication, and I promise you there's a reason behind giving the definition of this word. The word fornication means sexual intercourse between two people who are not married. Okay? Now that we've got that definition in the back of our mind, there seems to be some who are trying to add some definitions to that word today. When you go back and you look at the original, that original was just that one reason there. Some have tried to say that fornication can also include pornography. Pornography is a visual thing. It's wrong. It's sinful. But that is not the same as committing the actual physical act of fornication. Amen. Fornication is a physical act. Okay? And so now that we've got that in our minds, let's address a few more questions behind the question of what does the Bible say about remarriage. Here's our next question. Who is eligible to scripturally marry? Who is eligible to scripturally marry? Number one, somebody who has never been married before. Number two, somebody whose spouse has died, Romans 7:2. And then number three, somebody who has put away their spouse for fornication. Those are the three individuals who are eligible to marry or eligible to remarry. Now, I want to address something here on this side of a person who is eligible to remarry for just a moment. When I preached in Middle Tennessee, the congregation that I worked with there, they were a congregation that understood, on one hand, Matthew 19, 1 through 9. They knew that fornication was the only reason that a person could put away their spouse and get married once again. But there was another side of this subject that they really, really struggled with. I remember going in and talking with a family one time. The mother, she was very, very sick. She was in her early 90s. She had been battling leukemia for a number of years. And so whenever I would see her, she was always laid out on the couch, very, very weak. She struggled to be able to talk, struggled to be able to move. Life was a struggle at that time for her. And I remember one of the first times that I met her daughter. She lived with her daughter and her daughter's husband, her son-in-law. Her daughter and I began to talk one day. I said, well, how long have you and your husband been married? Her daughter was in her early 60s, and she said, oh, he and I, we've only been married 5 or 6 years. Okay. And she said, I was married before. And she would be very forward in letting people know, now I have a reason, I have a right to be able to remarry. I put my first husband away because he was unfaithful to me. But here's where the problem was. The man that she married was not a candidate for marriage. The man that she had married, he was on his third marriage, and none of his previous marriages were because of unfaithfulness. But she thought, because she was a candidate for remarriage, that she could marry anybody that she wanted to. You still have to marry somebody who's eligible to be married. Second individual, we had a lady that for a number of years was a teacher of the ladies' Bible class. Lady who's got some spiritual education about her. She's got some knowledge. When we first moved there, we knew that she was divorced. Her husband was well known all over the county for running around on her. She started dating a man while we were working there. She had been dating him for about 9 or 10 months. She called me on a Saturday afternoon and she said, we would love for you and Blair to come over tomorrow and have lunch with us. Sure, love to. We came over after worship, had lunch with them, had a wonderful lunch. After lunch was over, this lady looked across the table and she said, he's asked me to marry him. And she said, we want you to perform the wedding, the marriage ceremony. And I told her, I said, well, I've got just a few questions that I need to ask for just a moment. I know about your background, but I need to ask him about his background. And I asked him, I said, have you ever been married before? Yes. The second question was, are you divorced? Are you widowed? I'm divorced. The next question after that, why did you and your spouse get divorced? We couldn't get along. And I asked him, I said, was there any unfaithfulness and all? He said, no, we were always faithful to each other. You know what I said next? I can't go through with this. I'm not going to be able to marry you because you're seeking to marry a man who's not eligible to be remarried. He didn't fit the criteria of somebody who is eligible. So let's think about another question. Who is not eligible? Everyone that's not included in those three areas, the guilty party is not eligible, and those divorced for a reason other than fornication. Next question. These are some of the most popular, and so hopefully these will help you when you encounter these as well. What happens if a person remarries and they were the guilty party or divorced for any other reason? Let's go back to Matthew chapter 19. Let's look at verse number 9. Matthew 19, verse number 9. Jesus said, "Whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whosoever marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery." So when we think about that question, what if the guilty person remarries, or they remarry for any other reason other than fornication? Jesus says he committeth adultery. I love the King James, and one of the reasons why I love that translation, number one, is because of its reliability, but number two, because of some of the endings that you see in those words. I remember sitting in Brother Mosier's class. We took Greek a number of years ago. And he said, when you look at the King James and you see the ETH on the end of a word, always remember that in the Greek that's something that's indicating continuous action. And so when an individual marries and they've been the guilty party, or they marry because they've gotten divorced for any other reason, what does Jesus say? They continue to live in adultery. It's a continuous action. And somebody that continues to live in that sin, according to Galatians 5:19 through 21, Revelation 21 and verse number 8, those individuals are not going to have a part in heaven. Now, another question to consider: does Matthew 19:9 only apply to Christians? You ever heard somebody ask that before or make that statement? Matthew 19:9, you know that only applies to those who are Christians. That's a very popular one among some of our brethren, but that's actually a very, very reckless teaching. And here's the reason why. When you look at Matthew 19:9, there is a key word. I like to look for key words in a text. Jesus said unto them, "Whosoever shall put away his wife." Now focus in on that word, whosoever. How ridiculous does that sound to say that it only applies to Christians? Marriage existed long before Matthew 19. Marriage existed before the Great Commission. Marriage existed before Acts chapter 2. Now couple that with John 3:16. For God so loved the world, what's that next part? That whosoever, you see that word? Whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. He gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Now, how ridiculous would that be to say that the whosoever there applies to only those who are Christians? Or what about the last chapter of the Bible when you look at Revelation 22 in verse number 17, when he talks about whosoever will, let him take of the water of life freely. Does that make any sense? Absolutely not. It's just another way that individuals have tried to get around the teachings that Jesus clearly put out concerning the subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Next question: can baptism wash away an adulterous marriage? Let me ask you this question. If a person is living in homosexuality and they get baptized, can they continue being a homosexual? The answer to that is no. If a person is a habitual liar and they get baptized, can they continue being a habitual liar? The answer to that is no. So why is it the case that when individuals are living in adultery that they can be baptized and then now they can have that sin washed away? They can have it washed away, but they can't go and continue to live in that relationship. But there would be some that will advocate, hey, baptism washes away sin, so now they can continue to go and sin some more. That's in essence what they're saying. Here's what we need to remember about baptism. Baptism does not make an unholy action holy. Baptism does not make an unholy union holy. Here's another question to consider. What are the rights of the guilty? The guilty is to remain celibate, or they can reconcile with that spouse that they have been unfaithful to. Now someone says, that sounds really, really harsh. That sounds like a really, really harsh statement to say, that they have to remain celibate or they can reconcile, but that's the only way that they can ever have a relationship like that again. Let's put it in this context. Let's say that an individual is guilty of murder at 20 years old, and they are sentenced to spend the rest of their life without parole in prison. Can that person be forgiven of that sin of murder? The answer to that is yes. But it does not remove the consequences. Doesn't remove the consequences of that life sentence. There's no difference in a 20-year-old that divorces for a reason other than fornication. They can be forgiven, but they still have the consequences of that action. Now here's a final set of questions for us to consider as we bring our study to a close. Why will some people not get out of an adulterous marriage? Why will they not get out of an adulterous marriage? You ever talk to somebody and say, I just love them too much? I just love them so much that I can't get out of this relationship. I remember it was about 12, 13 years ago now. We were in the last few months before we moved to South Haven, that we were having a Bible study one night. It was on a Friday night. We were studying with a husband and wife. The husband was raised in the Baptist church, and his daddy was a Baptist preacher. We began to study that evening. We studied about the gospel, what a person needs to do to obey the gospel. We got to the subject of baptism, and I started to notice that he was getting very, very agitated the more and more he read about what the Scriptures teach in regards to baptism. And I said, what's wrong? Why are you getting so upset? And he said, I'm mad because my daddy never taught me the importance of baptism. We continued on. We talked about the one church, and he's getting more and more agitated. I'm mad because my daddy never taught me about the one church. This man is seeing it clearly. And I asked him, I said, are you willing to do anything to be right with the Lord this evening? Have your sins washed away? And he said, yes. I said, there's one more subject we need to talk about. We turned to Matthew 19. I knew about his marriage relationship. And I asked him, I said, can you read Matthew 19:9 for us? And he began to read it. And he stopped. The tears began to roll down his face. And this was his answer that he gave. He said, I cannot do what Jesus is asking me to do. And I just asked him, I said, what is Jesus asking you to do? He said, I'm living in adultery. And he said, Jesus is asking me to divorce this lady. And he said, I can't do it. He said, I love her too much. Number two, some will not get out of those relationships because of children, the emotional appeal. They don't want their children to grow up in a separated relationship. And number three, celibacy. I don't want to be alone. Let me give you just a few things to keep in mind with this. When people give that answer of love, that union is not a godly union. That union is built upon sin. That union is not built upon God. Number two, children. If you go back to Ezra chapter 10 and you look at verses 1 through 4, verse number 11, they were in some relationships that they needed to get out of. Children would be affected, but they needed to remain pure. And number three, celibacy. So harsh, but it is God's law. We had a couple that were visiting with us at South Haven. They had been visiting with us for about 2 to 3 months. They met with our elders one day and they said, "We want to place membership." They met in our conference room, talked with them for a while. Our elders asked several questions. One of them had to deal with their marriage. The husband had never been married before, but the wife, she was on her second marriage. Our elders asked, "What happened to your first marriage?" "We were divorced." "Why did you get divorced?" She wouldn't answer the question. The husband answered for her, and he said, "Guys," he said, "you don't have to let me serve and worship. I'm not interested in teaching a class. All we want to do is be on the roll here at the South Haven Church of Christ." And I'll never forget what one of our elders said. He said, "This is more than a role issue. This is a soul issue." When we talk about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, we're talking about a soul issue. Someone says, "What about abuse?" It's tragic when husbands and wives don't treat each other properly. And it may be one of those situations where you're struggling with honoring your God-given responsibilities. And if you're struggling with honoring your God-given responsibilities in that relationship, that is a present distress that may be at hand, 1 Corinthians 7. But when you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and you go through there, and as Paul is writing about that present distress, he is not teaching anything inconsistent with what Jesus taught. He was allowing for a separation, but not a remarriage. Please keep that in mind. As we close, why do marriages fail? Why do they fail? Because there are some marriages that aren't built with a lifetime commitment involved. Some have the, I'm trying, Wayne. I got one more. Some have the idea that it's just like buying a car. That when you get tired of this model, you can trade it in, you can sell it, and you can upgrade, and you can get you a new one. Some enter into marriage just to have a human arrangement. There are those that enter into marriage and they never give one thought about a spiritual bond. And the reason why a lot of marriages fail today is because there's not a spiritual bond that's there. One of the things that I encourage our young people constantly, please marry somebody who is a Christian. One of the leading causes for divorce is incompatibility religiously. Get that out of the way. Remove that. Have that common bond that's there so that that's not going to be an issue down the road once you're married. And then a final thought, final reason why marriages fail is they're not based on love. Someone says, "How can that be the case? You marry somebody because you love them." There are some people that only get married because of finances, because this will be an upgrade to me financially. There are some that only get married because this will upgrade me socially. This will cause me to be popular. And then there are some that only get married because of a physical attraction. What happens to our physical bodies over time? They begin to age, they begin to change. And if that relationship is only built upon a physical attraction, it's doomed to fail. I hope that our study this morning has been beneficial as we've tried to examine exactly what the Scriptures teach about the subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Thank you so much for your kind attention.